So in this video, I'm going to be breaking down our build.gradle file for our Android application. So where can we find that build.gradle file? Well, we're going to go to our Gradle script section here, and we are going to expand this. From there, you'll notice that we actually have two build.gradle files. So you're going to want to make sure you select the right one. That's this module app one, the second one here. So just to be clear, if I open up the other one says Hello Android 2 at the top, so this is actually the name of the project, and then the other says app at the top. You always want the one that says app at the top, or I shouldn't say always, but most usually you want the one with app at the top, right? So we're going to close this one, and we're going to focus on breaking this build.gradle file down. So what is our build.gradle file? Well, our build.gradle file essentially defines our build dependencies for our Android application. Not only does it define our build dependencies, but it also defines some of our configuration for our Android application. So you'll notice here that at the very bottom we have our dependencies, as I've promised, and our dependencies are essentially the packages that our Android application is dependent on. So you'll notice we have a few here. We have our app compat library, and then we have our support design library that our application is dependent on. And a lot of times when we select a specific version or a specific activity in our new project section, where we do those 4 screens where we create new Android applications, it will automatically include those dependencies for us. But sometimes it's worth mentioning, if you're having a problem with your Android application, it could be because you don't have the appropriate dependencies for it. So if you're having some trouble, this is going to be the place where you're going to want to go and add those dependencies. Great. So that's the first part, right? Our build.gradle file defines our Android dependencies. It also defines some of our configuration for our Android application. And this is where it does that, right inside here. So first up, the compiled SDK version right at the top. This is essentially what version of Android our application is being compiled with. So it's compiling our application with version 23 of Android. That's not to say that it won't work on earlier versions. It's just compiling it with this version so that our application always has access to all the newest Android features. Actually, by default, this compiled SDK version is going to be the latest version of Android that you have installed. Great. So now let's move on to this default config section. So this default config section, the first portion here is the application ID. It's just saying, okay, what is the package name for Android application? com.thomasbrown.helloandroid, right? Pretty simple. So our minimum SDK version, this is essentially when we were creating our new application and we gave the actual version of Android that we want to target or that we want our application to work with, this is the version we were selecting. So what this is saying is if anybody has an Android version or an Android device running version 19 or below, rather 18 or below, it's not going to work with our application, right? So this is the minimum required SDK version for a device to run our application. So our targeted SDK version is the highest version of Android that we've tested our application for. Great. So our version code is essentially a code that we give our application so that we can update it later on and Android will know that this is in fact a updated version. For example, if we create our Android application and we release it on the Google Play Store, if we want to release a new version, we have to increment this version code always by 1. So now I could say version 2, and if I wanted to update it again, I would say version 3, so on and so forth. Our version name is the actual version name that displays to our user. So say, on our first version we have 1.0, maybe on our second version we don't want 2.0, but we want something like 2.65. I don't know, something like that, right? So we can essentially define any version naming that works for us in that version name section. So to recap, our build.gradle file defines our build dependencies for our Android application, as well as some configuration for our Android application. And just as a quick side note, In the past, this default configuration was actually all done in our manifest file. So all this stuff and our dependencies and all this good stuff here was all in our Android manifest file, but Android moved over to compiling their applications or Android applications with Gradle scripts. And they moved some of that stuff from the manifest file into this build.gradle file. So if you're looking at, tutorials online and they have some of this stuff in the manifest file, that's why I'm telling you. I don't want you to get too confused. All right, guys, so that's going to do it for our video. We have successfully just broken down our build.gradle file. I'll see you in the next video.